Well, good morning, everyone. And it's a bit of a dreary morning. It's a little bit early, so we'll start with an easy one. So, on the theme that Emma was just using, those of you, hands up, who've got an iPhone, I'd like you to take it out and I'd like you to turn it over and read what it says on the back of the iPhone. You need quite good eyesight. You might have to borrow some glasses from someone sitting alongside you. And if you look at that iPhone, it says on it, designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. And iPhones are just one practical example of the complex and integrated supply chains across the global economy, where design and build can take place across a range of countries, with each step along the way adding value to the final product. If you measure trade purely in gross terms as a single transaction based upon the final price, you are missing the point. You do not understand the complexity and the importance of global value chains. And if you don't, you will fail to set the appropriate policy frameworks. And it's part of the challenge that we face in a rapidly changing world of trade. For example, we are in the middle of a revolution in e-commerce, and the digital economy is now a major part of global trade. And this has changed the game for everyone, from the largest corporations to the thousands of very small companies who have found it possible to trade internationally in a way they were never able to do before. Services are now a much larger part of the global economy than ever before, and yet the regulation around services has not kept pace with that development. The WTO estimates that while services comprise around 2/3 of global GDP and almost half of employment, and nearly half of the world trade on a value-added basis, the barriers to trade in services are around as large as those in goods half a century ago. And for the UK, as a services-orientated economy and the world's second largest services exporter, this clearly needs to change if we are able to unlock and realise the potential of our country as a truly global Britain. If we are to make the most of the opportunities for the global prosperity in front of us, it's essential that we draw up a new set of rules governing key areas such as e-commerce and cross-border data flows, and tackle head-on the obstacles to digital trade such as data localisation. We need to redouble our efforts to promote an open, efficient and transparent trading system. But somewhat alarmingly, we appear to be moving in precisely the opposite direction. For the first time in decades, the system of free, fair, rules-based international trade, which underpins our global prosperity, is under attack. Ever since the financial crisis of 2008, G20 countries have been taking steps to limit market access. Tariff and non-tariff barriers have been thrown up as countries try to defend or support domestic industries. Now, economists very rarely agree on anything, but there is a near universal conclusion that protectionism of this nature only ever leads to a deadweight loss. And the consensus is clear. Open and competitive markets are the most efficient vehicle for delivering the prosperity that we all want. Now, there's a lot of talk these days about tariffs in one form or another. And tariffs are a nice little euphemism, but in truth, they're simply a tax on imports. They're an impediment to the prosperity that we want, with far-reaching consequences. And we have a saying in our department that tariffs are taxes. You cannot like tariffs and dislike taxes, because they are the same. Tariffs mean people at home pay more for the things they use every day, and the businesses that we rely on to drive our economy will pay more to manufacture products with components from overseas. Tariffs hold back growth, hitting the poorest amongst us the hardest. And what is worse, broad-based protectionism provokes retaliation, driving up costs further. Drawing on data from over 150 countries, the IMF recently concluded that tariff increases had an overall negative impact, reducing productivity, reducing income, and reducing welfare, leading to higher unemployment, higher inequality, and incidentally, negligible effects on the trade balance. These barriers have the potential to dampen export orders and reduce manufacturing output, causing lost growth and, worryingly, kindling inflation. Throughout history, attempts to protect domestic industries through tariff barriers, such as the Long Depression of the 1870s and the Great Depression of the 1930s, have failed, and failed miserably. In contrast, the reversal of these policies after the Second World War had the opposite effect. People talk about the moon landings or the climbing of Everest as being pinnacles of human achievement. But when you look at the broader benefit, both of these things pale into insignificance compared to the liberalisation of trade. For the impact that this can have goes way beyond any story that GDP data can tell. It's about something far, far more precious. A study by the IMF found that a change in the real income of the bottom 20% of the population in developing countries was strongly linked with a change in trade openness. In the past 25 years, open and liberal trade has helped 1 billion of our fellow human beings be lifted out of abject poverty, creating jobs and raising incomes. I think that is one of the greatest achievements in human history. Or to put it more graphically, as Francis Fukuyama put it in his latest book, Identity, the percentage of children dying before their 5th birthday declined from 22% in 1960, the year before I was born, to less than 5% by 2016. That is a real and important achievement. And this unprecedented transformation in living standards has been made possible by the GATT, by the World Trade Organization, and our acceptance of a global rules-based system driving one of our greatest achievements to date. Of course, there are those who don't share this interpretation of events, who cannot channel their inner Adam Smith, as we do daily in the Department for International Trade, and who argue for intervention and protection. Now, it's certainly the case that some countries have historically developed their industries while simultaneously having high tariff barriers. And some have argued that this is the way forward for industries that require protection from more established competitors. But it's simply not the case. As the OECD has laid out, there's a clear link between global value chain integration and economic transformation for developing countries. The boom in international trade that we've seen since the Berlin Wall came down, which was running at about 8% a year, has seen developing economies as some of its biggest beneficiaries. Whereas in the past, some nations may have used tariffs to protect infant industries, in a world where both production and value chains were principally within that country, this model no longer works. As we've seen with that little iPhone example earlier, we now live in a world where complex value chains that cut across national boundaries are an ever more important part of how we do business. The use of imported intermediate goods and services has become dramatically more important for global exports. It's estimated that such trade has doubled, with the value added of imports as a share of exports rising from 10% in 1990 to around 20% in 2015. Imposing tariffs and non-tariff barriers in this globalized world threatens to fragment these supply chains, often damaging the very industries that they seek to protect. Now, a failure to understand the complexity of these global supply chains is also causing other problems. All too often we hear about how a reduction of our trade deficit is an improvement and an increase is a worsening. But of course, as most of you in this room know, this is only half the story. The way that statistics are currently calculated does not capture the value added by each stage of the production process, nor the role of subsidiaries abroad. And this has led economists to argue that some notional trade balances, most notably, of course, today, that between China and the United States, are very misleading. So returning just for the last time to the iPhone example, US import data will show that an iPhone purchased in the US as an import at the retail cost, which is recorded as a trade deficit for the US and a trade surplus for China. This doesn't reflect the point we've already seen, that only a fraction of its value is actually added in China. Most of its value is added in California. And of course, Apple is a US company, meaning that much of the profit will ultimately end up there. We've done work across UK statistics, looking at trade and value added as opposed to gross trade. And while it doesn't shift any of our trade relationships from surplus to deficit or vice versa, it does provide a massive dampening of the numbers. And as in trade policy with anything else, the statistics matter, because rubbish in equals rubbish out. You put in poor statistics, you're likely to put out poor policy. And that is why getting the empirical data right is extremely important. Hal Varian, Google's chief economist, has argued that the value of software in worldwide smartphones alone cuts the US trade deficit in half if you measure it by trade and value added rather than gross trade. But a free and open trading system also has to be a fair one. Free trade does not and cannot be allowed to mean a free-for-all. Despite its many successes, the international trading system is clearly not perfect, and we must do everything we can to ensure that rules are applied fairly, universally, and transparently. We cannot tolerate illegal dumping or subsidy, or the inability to determine whether a business is in fact in the state or the private sector. And in any dispute, our first port of call has to be the World Trade Organization, the home of the international rules-based system. And for all its fault, it represents the best hope of retaining a global consensus on how we operate our trading system. Now, the United Kingdom will soon take our independent seat on the WTO for the first time in over 40 years. And it's an opportunity for us to help shape the global debate. And working alongside our allies, we're making the case to update the WTO rulebook to tackle underlying trade tensions, which include industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and forced technology transfer. We must encourage trust and transparency in the WTO by updating the dispute settlement system and improving members' compliance with notification requirements. And we need to ensure that the system of special and differential treatment for developing countries is fit for purpose. Levelling the playing field involves carefully considering poorer countries' individual needs and ensuring that every country, from the poorest developing nation to the world's richest economies, reap the benefits of a liberal and rules-based system. And it's hard to describe just how out of date some of the rules are. I was meeting with my Chinese counterpart in the autumn last year discussing this very subject, and I said to him, back in 1995 when WTO was set up, if I'd asked you the following question: if I sell you a digital code over the internet to make something on your 3D printer, have I sold you a good or a service? You wouldn't have understood the question. And yet, with a rapidly changing global economy, we're still using many of the same rules to try to govern it as we were back in 1995, when the differentiation between what is a good and what's a service, as many of you in this room know, is becoming more difficult to ascertain day by day. Now, Britain is a great and historic trading nation, but we have never seen trade simply as an end in itself. Trade is a means by which we spread prosperity, and that prosperity underpins social cohesion, and that social cohesion in turn underpins political stability. That political stability is the building block of our collective security. It is a continuum which cannot be broken at any point without unwanted consequences. If we deny the benefits of a free trade system to those in developing parts of the world, do not be surprised at the consequences if we get greater migration or greater radicalization. Having that opportunity for all, the opportunity that we take for granted, is part of the collective security for our future. We need to recognize that it's a win-win system. We need to get away from the mindset that if I've got a trade surplus with you, I'm the winner. If you've got a trade surplus with me, I'm the loser. The concepts in trade are much more complex, and we can genuinely create a win-win global environment. But the system cannot be taken for granted, and those of us who genuinely believe in free trade and competition have a duty to recommit ourselves to the multilateral system with the WTO at its centre. Of course, let us recognise its faults and weaknesses, but let's act collectively to make it work for all its members, large and small, rich and poor, for today and for tomorrow. And as we prepare to leave the European Union, the United Kingdom has now a Department for International Trade dedicated to helping businesses across the country to export, driving inward and outward investment, negotiating market access and trade agreements, and championing the concept and the benefits of free trade. It's why we now have a network of Her Majesty's Trade Commissioners with the experience and the autonomy to drive our trading performance in specific markets, from China to North America to Africa, and you'll hear from some of them later on today. However, this is not a mission that government can ever fulfill alone. Businesses like the ones represented here today have a crucial role to play. And we want everyone who understands the vast opportunities that free trade represents and the prosperity it brings to make this case, to be a voice promoting the benefits of the global multilateral trading system and making the case throughout the UK and abroad. We want you to make the case for international trade in practical terms, how it benefits your business, your communities, and makes a real difference to people's lives. It's this case that will win the battle against the siren voices of protectionism, a battle in which we all need to be engaged. We should not be bystanders in our own future. We need to set a firm course to shape the coming era for Britain and the rest of the world. And the bottom line is that we all have to succeed, because the price of failure is too high to contemplate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Please, we have a few minutes left for questions from the floor. So if you can raise your hand, we have some roving mics that will be coming round, racing their way to you. Please, if you can introduce yourself and then ask your question.
It's Matt Dathan from The Sun. Secretary of State, how do you feel about the prospect of staying in the Customs Union until 2022? And if that is what is agreed with Labour, how could you stay in your job?
Well, why did I think it was too much to hope to get a question on international trade? So effectively, we have agreed to remain part of the Customs Union as part of the implementation period, as part of the agreement they have. My worry would be a permanent state of a Customs Union with the European Union, as I've set out on innumerable occasions. And there are reasons why being in a permanent union with a Customs Union with the European Union would be bad for Britain. For example, the European Union would be able to make access to the UK market part of their offer in any trade agreement, and we would find ourselves in a unique position in our trading history in that we would be being traded. We would be a commodity in that particular agreement, where the EU would be able to offer access to the UK as part of their offer. And then, since I know that services are a very big part of those in this grouping today, if we were unable to vary tariffs on goods as part of any negotiation, and we wanted to access someone else's services market to be able to sell more from Britain, if you can't alter your tariffs on goods, what would we offer? We already have a very open services environment in the UK. We would be diminishing the tools we would need to lever greater openness in other markets like service markets. It's a situation that would leave the United Kingdom as a rule taker, and in terms of our ability to shape trade policy, would probably leave us in a worse situation than we are today inside the European Union. So it's not a good position for the UK to have. I say in as best understatement I can make this time in the morning.
Yes, please.
Simon Jack, BBC News. You made a stout defence for getting rid of all tariffs. What I think most businesses would agree with that. Do you disagree with your own government's position on protecting UK farmers?
No, we haven't said that we want to get rid of all tariffs. If you look at what we set out in terms of the no-deal day one tariff offer, for example, we wanted to reduce tariffs where possible to minimise any inflationary effect. And we're an economy that, when you look at our exports, is actually very dependent on import prices. About 23% of our exports have an import content within that. So we need to make sure that we have a very open trading environment. But clearly, as I've also said, we cannot allow completely unfair competition, and we need to ensure that we've got the appropriate protections in place where necessary, and where industries have to make adaptations over time. It's a lot easier to make changes in some industrial production than it is in agricultural production, for example. So we also have to look at the issue around food security, and to make sure that we are not leaving our country unprotected from unforeseen circumstances in that most basic of commodities.
David Hughes from the Press Association. One of the great prizes which has been championed by you and other Brexiteers is the prospect of a trade deal with the United States. We got the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in town today issuing a stern warning about the UK's dealings with Huawei and allowing it to form part of the 5G network in non-core parts. Does the prospect of potentially damaging relations with the US, is that outweighed by the prospect of building relations with China, because you also want a trade deal with them?
Well, we haven't made any, as you know, the government hasn't made a decision yet around that particular Huawei issue, whatever you read in some of the press. And we need to take into account the issues of an open trading system, but we also have to ensure protection, particularly in our critical national infrastructure, and that we'll do. We had some very constructive discussions with our US colleagues last week. I spent a number of hours with them, and I think that we discovered that there was much less of a difference between us than some had thought. But these are issues that we will take forward. When it comes to dealing with China, our analysis of the problems doesn't vary much from the United States. We have said, and I've said very publicly, and I've said in Beijing as in Washington, I said that we simply cannot tolerate behaviour where we can't tell if a business is actually in the state sector or the private sector. We can't tolerate forced tech transfer as part of the agreement of being allowed to trade in China. We can't allow the sort of subsidies and dumping that we've seen. We simply disagree with the mechanisms that the United States have adopted in dealing with that, particularly things like the steel and aluminium tariffs. We think there are better ways to go about that, and we think that that is best done by a strengthened WTO. The alternative to a rules-based system is, frankly, a deals-based system, and that's unlikely to be very satisfactory to the vast majority of trading nations.
Do we have a question from one of our delegates, perhaps? Yes, thank you.
My name is Gabriel Buck from GKB Ventures. Secretary of State, I've been in the trade finance business for nearly 30 years, and all of that time I've never come across a UK company that has ever mentioned any European regulation that has hindered or stopped them from exporting to either inside or outside of Europe. What have I missed?
Well, it's not a question of the regulation that exists at the present time. You need to look at the wider trading picture. And even if Britain had decided to stay in the European Union, we had to improve our trading performance. Our exports as a proportion of GDP fell well behind the leading European country, Germany. There are all sorts of reasons for that, which we would spend the next 2 hours going into. So it's not a question of could we trade more if we were inside the European Union still? The answer is yes. The question is, where are the markets opening up? in the rest of the world, and where would you require the freedom? If you look at the EU as a proportion of our trade, it's fallen from about 56% about 12 years ago to 44% today. It may well shrink further as a result of the Eurozone slowdown as a proportion of our total. The IMF have said that 95% of global GDP growth in the next 10 years will be outside continental Europe, which we've all seen. And the question is, will we be able to take advantage? Now, you mentioned is there a specific example? I'll give you one. I don't believe that you can have a modern trading system where you can move goods and services, but not data. And yet inside the European Union, as you know, there's quite a split. 24 countries plus the Commission want us to remove data localization restrictions, but France, Germany, Slovenia and Austria are a blocking minority. Outside the European Union, we've got more freedom to be able to deal with the movement of data and data flows. A lot of these issues will be things that come out in the future. So what we do require is to pull off a relatively difficult trick. How do we maintain sufficient close alignment with the European Union to be able to have as frictionless trade as possible outside the single market, while at the same time keeping our hands free to be able to negotiate new trading agreements as we need to do so in a whole range of potentially unknowable sectors as suits our national interest. It's a complex question which you would never actually understand from much of the public discourse in this country, but that is why the government seeks its withdrawal agreement, which gives us not frictionless trade, because you can't have frictionless trade outside the single market, but as frictionless as possible, and as many benefits of a customs union as we can get in terms of no tariffs, no common external tariff, no rules of origin checks, without actually being inside a customs union. It is, I think, a necessary next move in how we conduct global trade in any case. And we've got the opportunity to take a lead, I think, in modelling that here in the UK.
We're going to take our very final question from Slido. It's finally working. So we have a question here from Richard Burge. How do we ensure that legitimate trade values, environmental and health standards and climate impact, for example, are not seen simply as non-tariff barriers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But one country's legitimate interest might be seen as another, as a protectionist barrier, and we have to be very careful that we keep them to an agreed minimum. That is why I think it's so important that we keep the WTO system, so that we are able to conduct those debates on a rational basis, and to make sure that countries are not using excuses of single commodities or single policy areas as an excuse to provide protection. You can all see very quickly how that would end. And to give you a practical example of that, where the United States has used national security as a pretext on steel and aluminium tariffs, we think it's completely inappropriate. And to give you an example of why we need the WTO system, we now find ourselves in the virtually Alice in Wonderland position of having steel tariffs applied to us by the United States in the name of national security, when much of that steel from the United Kingdom goes into the American submarine program, and we're a unique provider of that. It's a very good example of why you need to keep a rules-based system, and why if you allow countries to make exceptions for themselves, eventually we will have a plethora of barriers to global trade, and we'll be unable to make that movement towards liberalisation, which will be hugely to the benefit of the global economy, particularly the poorest in the global economy. It's very easy for rich countries to say, we've got up the ladder so far, and now we're going to pull the ladder up behind us. That is not a route to global stability, prosperity or security.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy agenda to be with us.